All right, fantastic. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for bearing with the technical difficulties. Like we like to say, technology is great when it works properly, but we're glad you're all here. And myself and my colleagues are proud to present today, and we're going to talk about behavioral health and how it connects with the criminal justice system. And as we all know, in the 21st century, we've seen an evolution of that process. We're going to go over a real live case study, one that I'm particularly working on that involves the local sheriff's office and what we're doing to have a greater responsibility and interaction with mental health. And then my colleagues, Dr. Michael Pittaro and Dr. Chuck Russo, in addition to Corporal Charles Malone, who actively works with me on my case study, we're going to go through different parts of the criminal justice system. So you're going to hear everything from not only about our at-risk populations within a local community, but you're also going to hear some internal things. You're going to hear some things involving corrections. You're going to hear some things involving law enforcement and the impact and the comprehensive nature of what behavioral health is doing as we progress with the criminal justice system and advance in society. So if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's just dive right in. Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office Behavioral Resources Unit. Let's see. Okay. Would it be fair to say, think for yourself, and if you're familiar with where Tampa and Hillsborough County is, we're a very populated county. We're the local Bay Area. But think about your own jurisdiction. Would it be fair to say, if you were asking yourself this, where you currently live, would 1% of your population suffer from some kind of moderate to serious mental illness or diagnosed or undiagnosed condition? And you start to think, most of the times that I've asked this question in relation to my own case study and my own sheriff's office, or I've asked it abroad in other conferences, people always say, you need to go higher. You need to take the number up. But being conservative with our statistics, and I always like to go conservative with numbers, I just use the population and I say 1%. Currently in Hillsborough County, we have 1,510,070 of our closest friends, relatives, and others. And if you take 1% of our jurisdiction, 500,000 going to the Tampa Police Department, which is an incorporated area within Hillsborough County, and you leave the rest for the county sheriff's office, that's over 1 million people. And when you think about that, that's over 10,000 individuals just with a mental illness, serious or undiagnosed condition. Additionally, now you add to it problems of dementia, say for instance, Alzheimer's. Currently within Hillsborough County, we have over 17,000 diagnosed cases. So you can see the comprehensive nature of just what we call the 1%ers that we have to deal with within our jurisdiction. Now you can apply that to other jurisdictions pretty much on a parallel in terms of percentage. Let's meet a 1%er. You see on your screen right here, this is Michael Underwood. He came to the jurisdiction of Hillsborough County in early 2015. Now, the numbers there that you see when you look at events, 256 events since 2015. What does that mean? That means a deputy sheriff in a car going to a call being dispatched. So 256 times since 2015, he has attracted a call for service, whether it's a citizen calling it in or if someone sees him and while on patrol on the side of the road, doing whatever he's doing as a homeless individual and mentally ill. But he's required 256 responses. Now, in terms of charges, those encounters resulted in 39 charges. In Florida, we have what's called a Marchman Act and a Baker Act. A Marchman Act is in relation to someone's state of intoxication. If they're unaware of their surroundings, they're unable to provide self-care due to their intoxication level, whether it be alcohol or drugs or both, then we can take him into custody under a Marchman Act. He's been Marchman Acted 67 times. Well, it was on the last time that he was arrested in April of 2021 by another local agency, the Plant City Police Department, which is within Hillsborough County, but it has its own incorporated jurisdiction. He ended up in jail. Well, he normally is within our area. of the sheriff's office patrol responsibility. We made contact, the unit that I helped develop, we made contact with Mike in the jail. Now, we've tried numerous times to get Mike off the street. We've tried to make a connection with him in terms of his mental health. In spite of your best efforts, sometimes it may click, sometimes it may not. But in the new version of our unit and what we're trying to do with mental health clinicians, licensed clinicians, and we'll get to that in just a minute, we were able to make a connection with Mike that we had not made before. Fast forward a few weeks of working with him, making that connection, working on his mental health, we were able to get him into an assisted living facility. The process of doing that is not an easy one, but again, you involve people with social work degrees, licensed clinicians. It becomes a much easier process for us as law enforcement to help facilitate that process to go from jail to an assisted living facility and deal with all the legal parameters in between. Well, we like to call Mike a success story because if you look at the picture and you go from left to right, it's kind of almost like a glamour shot. It's not doctored, it's just natural. And the way he looks today is the picture on the right-hand side. The way he was before was his last booking photo. So you can see the transformative nature of what happens if you're able to make that connection with a clinician, with law enforcement, all of us working together. And that's really what we call as good as it gets. We've gotten this person from probably potentially dying on the street and being a call we have to work as a dead body call to being in an assisted living facility. He's able to reconnect with his family. He has long-term stabilization. That's a success story in terms of what we would like to see with our 1%ers. What would I like you to take away from my part of the presentation and from the collective today? I want you to be able to define and identify our at-risk populations and how we would know who they are in terms of programmatic intervention. I'd like you to learn how to implement best practices in determining how a behavioral unit would be structured and be implemented. I would also like you to learn and understand how you would evaluate such a program if you were to do one at your local agency. This is a brand new process. The Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office is not the only agency that's developing a mental health unit. In fact, here in the Bay Area, we have about 5 or 6 different agencies that have rather robust units. Interestingly enough, we all meet once every 3 months, and everybody has a different spin on this. Everybody has a different take of how they're approaching risk mitigation, identifying the at-risk populations, and setting up their unit for success. Understand some of the origin, kind of why did we start this in law enforcement? What are some actual technology or technological things that we're doing in order to help this process? Because we don't do anything in a vacuum in law enforcement. We go right after it. We also rely heavily on technology. How do we get here in brief? It goes back to 1963 Community Mental Health Act. In essence, we went from psychiatric hospitals to a community mental health model where we have a lot of public organizations, nonprofits out there that provide mental health and behavioral health care rather than just institutionalizing people. As we know, society has changed a lot in the last half century. The definition of the family concept has changed a lot in the last half century. What you may have relied upon family and community mental health 50 years ago, we have to be able to adapt and change those definitions to today. While it was well-intended, there have been some hiccups in the system. And as we've seen the expansion of the mental health crisis, we don't necessarily have all the resources in place to deal with the magnitude of the problem, especially because law enforcement has been, and criminal justice overall has been pushed into the forefront of this problem. And in essence, when I've done surveys, what I have found is, without fault, most correctional institutions, and Dr. Pittaro may hit on this later, it's at least 30 to 50% of the jail population or correctional setting has inmates that have some kind of diagnosed or undiagnosed mental illness. One of the stark stats that's out there is basically 1 in 4 of every fatal law enforcement use of deadly force encounters involve people that have severe mental illness. They become armed, usually it's with a firearm, and it gets dangerous very quickly. So we have a systemic problem. How do we deal with that in law enforcement? What does the public want? It's really about the consent of the governed. It's what society is wanting law enforcement to do. If mental health is going to be in our ball court, so to speak, then how do we best respond to that? This research that I'm doing is based off of action research by Kurt Lewin. He was an early 20th century psychologist. He does a lot of work in the field of education, but a lot of work involving organizational change. And organizational change is what you're trying to do when you're injecting mental health professionals directly into a law enforcement practice to work side by side in conjunction with law enforcement practitioners, sworn personnel. So very quickly, if you look at it, it's about unfreezing current behavior, making a change, and then refreezing that behavior. And by freezing, we mean locking it in, making it becoming the norm. Well, how do we do that? What is the process? And it's utilized through planning, action, and results, and it's through feedback loops. But that's the basis of the kind of research that we've undertaken in this case study at the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office to interact that change, unfreezing, changing, and refreezing with feedback loops. Ultimately, we will be using program process evaluation to go in. We've been in this process for a little over a year. So we will go back in and we will follow a program evaluation model to come back around and evaluate what's been done to this point. Again, looking at standards of utility, feasibility, propriety, accuracy. There's a whole lot involved with other than just starting a mental health unit. But we'll use that process evaluation to see what kind of objectives and outcomes that we have met with the program, and to go back in and reactivate that change process, unfreeze, change, and refreeze behavior to help perfect that process.
I'm Hillsborough County Sheriff Chad Cronister. As law enforcement officers, every day we encounter people with needs that require special attention. It's our goal to make sure the most vulnerable of our population receives the utmost care. That's why we are excited to launch Project Safe Encounter. There are a number of conditions or illnesses that make it hard for some citizens to communicate with our deputies. If you or a loved one has Alzheimer's disease, blindness, autism, Down syndrome, deafness, or other medical or developmental disabilities, you can register for Project Safe Encounter online. You simply provide a photo and a brief description of your loved one's special needs. If your elderly relative or child goes missing, having that background will aid in the search and help deputies communicate with them once they're located. Through this voluntary program, we hope to provide faster, more effective assistance to your family members in a crisis. To learn more about Project Safe Encounter or to register, head to teamhcso.com.
Project Safe Encounter is one of the technology advances that we launched at the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office in conjunction with the Behavioral Resources Unit. Developed it in December of 2020, launched in January 26th of 2021. It is 100% voluntary on the citizen's part to provide their medical HIPAA type information so that it can populate into our data system so that only deputies can see it when they bring it up, or it populates for a call for service. You say, well, what would be the advantage for someone to give up that kind of information? It could help a deputy understand what they're walking into, whether it be a disturbance, a suicide call, or some other crisis situation, other than just seeing what's right in front of them and trying to make some kind of, I call it street diagnosis based upon their years of experience and or other training. They now have an affirmative upfront piece of knowledge as to what's going on with this person, and they can help gauge their response. They can request additional assistance. And as I indicated, it's strictly voluntary. To date, we have 51 registrants, 48 by the family, 3 by self-identification. I anticipate that growing over time as people's comfort level grows with entrusting law enforcement with their information.
One disappears, every second counts, and that's where high tech tracking devices for those at high risk really come in handy. Paul Mueller joins us now live from Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office. And Paul, how often do deputies actually use this technology?
They use it all the time, Josh. It's called safety net, and people wear bracelets just like this one right here, and they have proven themselves time after time to be lifesavers.
She had gone in the store and then had left.
It's a high-profile case that left the community in crisis. 11-year-old Jenna Ermler with Asperger's syndrome, missing for nearly 40 hours. Then the homecoming everyone hoped for. But there's a little-known technology that could have helped in a case like this.
She's a strong walker.
From the ground to the air, a trained team of Hillsborough County Sheriff's deputies using tracking technology to find people in a matter of minutes.
It's very important. It's life-saving.
Life-saving for families with loved ones who have autism or Alzheimer's who vanish.
Let me get a little closer to it. You hear that, Trip?
Here's how it works. They wear these safety net bracelets. They give off a radio frequency. The receiver then picks it up within a mile on the ground, 7 miles in the air. And when time is of the essence,
If I had the bracelet on and I was 20 miles away, how quickly could you find me?
Utilizing air, we'd be able to find you within 5 minutes, 2 to 5 minutes.
Dr. Karen Berkman with the Center for Autism and Related Disabilities at USF.
We know this is a major concern, so we really want to be ahead of this.
The difference between wearing a bracelet and not wearing a bracelet.
It's life-saving. The difference is life-saving.
Life-saving indeed. In the last case just a week ago, deputies got the call and it took them just 5 minutes from when they got that call to actually finding the guy who disappeared, Josh.
That's unreal. At 7 miles from the air, that's pretty amazing. So why don't more people wear these devices?
You know, that's a great question. And the answer is simple, because people just don't know about these bracelets. So if you are interested in it, or if you know someone who is interested in it, you're urged to call the Sheriff's Department.
All right, good tip. Paul Mueller live for us in Hillsborough County. Thanks, Paul.
We've been in this program since 2009, but it's been upgraded multiple times. And as you can see, it's great at helping us locate people with dementia that have the bracelet on. The average recovery time is about 30 minutes. And now we're combining that with our clinicians and our behavioral health deputies to make a further impact. Currently, it's up to about 300 registrants. 50 of those within the county reside within the city of Tampa. It's anywhere from 6 to a dozen people are located a year that wander off and have this technology that are recovered. That's the Behavioral Resources Unit mission statement. You can see it there on your screen. I'm not going to read it, but I want you to pay attention to the translation part. Do no harm, make an impact. And if that's one thing that we're trying to focus on in law enforcement, and specifically with our program here in its development, is we don't want to make anything worse. We're here to help. We're here to make an impact. And in fact, the impact is not just about arresting anybody or even Baker acting somebody. It's about connecting with community resources. It's about expanding someone's reach into that community mental health network. In a way, it's like combining social work with law enforcement and getting out there and helping people find answers to these difficult situations. Currently, this unit that's being constructed has 5 deputies per patrol district. There's 5 districts across over 1,000 square miles of Hillsborough County, serving over 1 million people in population. But each district has a behavioral health deputy. We're going to describe what that is briefly here in a second. We have a homeless initiative section that has 5 deputies, 1 again per district, that exclusively deals with the homeless population, because not only do they have codependency, not only do they have, mental illness and other issues, they have the primary logistical issue of being homeless on top of everything else. Our clinical section has 6 licensed clinicians. I believe we're going to go to 2 clinicians per district and expand by another 4 clinicians here in the spring. And it's important to understand our case management model. How do we respond? We always respond with law enforcement working together with a clinician. We're a co-responder model. We like to say we use clinicians in addition to, not in lieu of. So we don't expect a social worker or a mental health counselor to go to any call by themselves, no matter what it is, because of the perceived danger, the potential for instability that you're dealing with, and volatility of coming in contact with somebody who may have a behavioral health condition, at varying degrees of severity, or just from a standpoint, how do we know what we're walking into? We don't expect these licensed clinicians from a safety standpoint to go unarmed and untrained from a tactical sense out there into the public to engage. So we always like to have a specially trained deputy there to provide that co-response. It's a collaborative model. Primary functions, again, we want to identify and follow up on our high utilizers. We do that by data pulls, calls for service, and self-identification and direct referral. We provide resources to the homeless and mentally ill, connect them with the community mental health model. We identify and mitigate homeless camps. We mitigate mental health related calls for service. In Florida, we have something akin to a red flag law. If you're outside of Florida, you've heard it called a red flag law. We call it risk protection orders. It's the ability to suspend someone's Second Amendment rights under the right auspices of state law. It's done through the court system by petition. It's filled out in what's called an ex parte order in order to briefly suspend their Second Amendment rights and the ability to own firearms and ammunition due to the propensity for violence and or mental health. And that's part of what the Behavioral Resources Unit responsibility is. And again, we can't do any of this without an extensive network of community partnerships, whether it be donations to the homeless or resourcing out these clients, these people in need, these at-risk members of the community to the resources that they need to provide an answer. I'm going to let Corporal Charles Malone interject if he can get on board here and describe briefly what the behavioral health deputy does. You there, Charles?
I'm here, sir. Ready to go.
You're on, Charles. Go ahead.
I'm here. So, good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me here. I just want to talk shortly about the behavioral health deputies. Like Sergeant Benton already stated, the behavioral health deputies and our clinicians, whether they be licensed clinical social worker, licensed mental health counselor, they primarily work day to day together. And what my role is in the unit, also working alongside with Sergeant Benton, we get all the calls for service that come in either through a daily or nightly report from the supervisors that are working patrol. We also look at our record management system, and that's how we generate the work. And that's also how we can tend to notice who the repeat call for service, high needs, high utilizers people are. We look at all of that stuff, and that's how we assign the work out to each one of our behavioral health deputies that are assigned to each one of our districts. What they do is they will either respond to the home, or they may decide this is a person that we want to make a phone call and set something up with, or we'll just confirm whether or not they need any of our additional services and connections to the community.
Charles, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
Can everyone hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. What the behavioral health deputy does once they receive follow-up assignments from myself or Sergeant Benton, whether that be someone who is a high needs, high utilizer individual or an individual who just may have just had a bad night, the collaborative efforts of the behavioral health deputy and the clinician will set the conditions for them to make contact with an individual or the individual's family so that they could get them connected to additional behavioral health services within our community. What we're really trying to do is mitigate, and control the calls for service so that it reduces the amount of times that law enforcement is interacting with somebody who may just have either co-occurring disorder or mental health issue. In some cases, we've had people who've been diagnosed with dementia. A lot of those people end up generating calls for service that might not always necessarily need a law enforcement response. And so that's where our behavioral health deputy with their additional training comes in place, working collaboratively with our clinicians to try and come up with some kind of active community engagement plan to get a solution that is good for everyone.
Thank you, Charles. Appreciate it. And just some quick statistics. Just last month, we reviewed 309 Baker Acts. That's basically 309 different cases that come in. There's other stats that break that down, but you can see the volume is pretty high for the unit. But we make contact with each one of those people and we move forward in the process of referral. I'm not going to go into the homeless initiative deputy. I want to pass this off to my colleague, Chuck Russo, Dr. Russo, and let him get into his part of it because it's very important. But just understand that they're in camps, they're out there. We see them on the side of the roadway. I don't need to paint a picture to you of what a homeless individual is like. I showed you Mike Underwood at the very beginning. He is the quintessential case study for that and a true success story. Our clinicians are either master's degree social workers or master's degree licensed mental health clinicians, and they work conjointly with a deputy. But without further ado, I'll hand it off to my good colleague, Dr. Chuck Russo. Chuck.
Thank you very much. If you could release the screen, I appreciate that. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm Dr. Chuck Russo. I am the department chair of Human Justice and the Criminal Justice Department at American Public University System. I also spent, my law enforcement career spanned 4 decades, and I retired just a couple of years ago. And what this came out of is something I was working on when I was still sworn at the Daytona Beach Police Department. And since I've retired in 2013, have continued to work on and develop. And we know that on a daily basis, law enforcement officers encounter individuals displaying mental health symptomology. And it's unfortunate that typically the public only hears about law enforcement's adverse interactions with these individuals when things go awry, which they unfortunately do, and there's negative outcomes. So now when these situations do occur, the law enforcement officers and typically the agency enter a reactionary mode and are forced to respond to media inquiries, social media hype in real time. In both the message and the rhetoric, law enforcement can really come across as defensive, confusing, uncaring, and even evasive. However, what I found out and what we've found out is really this doesn't have to be the case anymore. We have the ability to get ahead of some of these encounters, and it's by partnering with others and demonstrating a genuine concern to the mental health community. And to do so, it would be beneficial to create the position of a mental health agency liaison officer. Now, in this role, the mental health agency liaison officer serves really as a link between the law enforcement entity, the agency, mental health agencies, even substance abuse agencies, and local social service agencies. So this includes both the for-profit side as well as the nonprofit side of community-based mental health in each district and jurisdiction. And as many mental health agency meetings and events are held during normal business hours, what we found it to be actually best to designate an administrative member of the law enforcement agency as this liaison officer. And whether it's an administrative sergeant, an administrative lieutenant, or even higher ranking individual who's free of the needs to respond to calls for service, they have the, or can actually better say, they can make the time necessary to attend these meetings and events that are required for someone in such a role. So the officer would work in partnership with the symbiotic agencies on tasks such as education, networking, public awareness, public safety, outreach events, and actually act in the role of facilitating of referrals between agencies, and can help to foster and sustain a positive relationship between the agencies, local government, mental health agencies, vocational rehab, as well as social service agencies. Now, this individual in this position would essentially serve as an advocate by attending and participating in law enforcement, mental health, substance abuse agencies board meetings. And this individual would actively serve on participating agencies' board of directors as required or requested. In Volusia County, where I retired from Daytona Beach, we have a multiple mental health agencies, social service providers within the city of Daytona Beach, as well as within the greater county. And by designating one individual as this liaison officer between law enforcement and these agencies, again, mental health, substance abuse, social service, the flow of internal and external communications really improves. And we're able to facilitate and grow a positive alliance among all that are involved. The oversight provided by this liaison officer actually demonstrated the effectiveness and importance of this alliance, by fostering solutions And it actually served to decrease the myths and negative community-based perceptions that were held by some of these other non-law enforcement agencies. Now, what we found with this is that, it increased familiarity among the officers, the agency, and again, all these service providers. It put the officer and essentially then the agency in a constant advocacy role for those experiencing mental illness and substance abuse issues. And all the internal and external participants, work together to cohesively facilitate a united partnership. This liaison officer created an enhanced positive interaction between all involved, between the agencies and those diagnosed with mental illness, substance abuse, dependency issues, and the agencies that serve those clients. Now, this collaborative approach also helped provide education back to law enforcement, back to the agency. Because from this, we're able to determine, a best practices model of how to approach persons with varied needs, experiencing different mental health issues without really creating the situation even worse. We've all seen well-defined links between mental health and drug use, anger issues, crime, and homelessness, as already discussed. And while agencies, law enforcement agencies may seek a strict deterrent, for drug or anger issues, which typically ends up as incarceration, the mental health agencies, may be able to weigh in with a more rehabilitative approach, drug treatment, anger management, and such, that could essentially reduce these flare-ups from people experiencing these issues, and would actually put a less of a burden then on the agency itself and the agency's stressed resources. Now, in addition, this liaison officer can provide a single voice to these agencies on many of the concerns from a law enforcement standpoint. A uniform and consistent message on these issues, can help standardize the process and response from law enforcement agencies and law enforcement officers to these mental health issues. It makes it easier for mental health agencies to understand and know what to expect from law enforcement's response when there is a call for service, or when there's a need for law enforcement to interact with these individuals. And it could lead to future support of the same issues and concerns. If law enforcement and mental health agencies support each other in their respective roles, it could go a long way in quelling concerns in the event of public scrutiny, which unfortunately we know will in fact occur at some point in the future. Now, an excellent example of this involves recent move with some agencies in taking approaches of de-escalation principles and techniques, putting these into practice. And de-escalation is using a tool to resolve hostile situations, often involving individuals with mental illness or experiencing an episode. And it's based on the sanctity of human life. And it really seeks to use communication, not force, as the preferred method for handling those issues and incidents. Now, as community and mental health agencies understand that law enforcement wants to identify and utilize non-force options, to help subjects experiencing mental health issues or involved in incidents or flare-ups, it can go a long way in helping to promote a mutual respect and a desire for cooperation. Now, this liaison officer could serve as a key figure in integrating fiscal needs among the mental health, substance abuse, and social service agencies by bringing in grant revenue and other funding sources to the attention of these agencies. For example, utilizing Veterans Affairs for military veterans with mental health needs, and say pharmaceutical companies for those experiencing substance abuse issues. The agency, and in fact, and the liaison officer in this case, can act as like a neutral third party and could connect previously disjointed agencies that are often consistently in desperate need of funding and additional resources to serve the complex needs of their clientele. As many of us in law enforcement have known over the years, we see these grant applications where more so they're requiring partnerships. And by law enforcement bringing their grant resources, making those available to these social service agencies, these mental health agencies, Again, it may make obtaining grants and obtaining resources much easier and better for all that are involved, which would be a huge plus for everybody. Now, by having a single officer in this role, the agencies demonstrate an active willingness to partner with, mental health, again, substance abuse and social service agencies. And this will serve as a targeted effort to provide innovative solutions to assist those diagnosed with mental illness and substance abuse dependence issues. The liaison officer could become an integral problem solver in the mental health and substance abuse community by working independently with each agency to provide reliable support, collaborative functional resources for individuals and families, suffering the disorderly destruction associated with many of these issues. Now, in addition, this liaison officer will provide supportive assistance for individuals and agencies addressing mental health symptomology. And this cooperative support, will go just bring community-wide mental health and substance abuse assistance while addressing the plethora of concerns associated with all these diagnoses. Now, if you can see on the PowerPoint, if you're viewing it, we have lots of benefits. This is how, if you can see, on the area on one part of the screen, how, would act, link participants, again, relationship builder, advocate, coordinator, communicator, develop best practices that come back to the agency and then can get passed on to those serving in the street. But it also demonstrates, this willingness to partner, to provide solutions, to be a problem solver, and to be even a greater resource in the community. Now, we know things will end badly and with some of these situations, and there unfortunately isn't a whole lot we may be able to do because as law enforcement, we're in reactionary mode. But, when something does end badly, and what I always was, as I was working up my chain and telling those in control of budget issues, wouldn't it be better to be viewed as part of the problem or part of the solution? You can take your pick. And as I said, this started out from what I was doing with the Daytona Beach Police Department. I was doing a lot of work with post-traumatic stress among agency personnel, developed a critical incident response team for the agency. So I started getting more and more involved in the mental health aspect of things. And from that, specifically from the post-traumatic stress work I was doing, I was in contact with some of these other mental health agencies. And we ended up developing a partnership to the point where I was asked to come on their board of directors. And we saw, just from being on one agency, just the way things now, the mental health agency saw law enforcement differently. And the interaction was very different than what previously existed. And we saw this as something as a positive. And from that one essentially chance encounter, started reaching out with other mental health agencies, substance abuse agencies, even the methadone clinic, and working in partnership with these agencies. And because of my role at the police department at the time, I essentially became that person, plus with my educational background and such. And when I retired, one of my previous academy students from many, many years ago, who I still work with often, he essentially, we ended up placing him in that role that I had. And I'm still working with, he's on the board of directors now of one mental health agency, probably will be on another one soon, and acts as that liaison between, these social service agencies, the mental health, the substance abuse and such, and the law enforcement agencies, the police department. And it's just, we've seen the relationship greatly improve over the years to where something unfortunately negative does occur when one of these incidents goes sideways, that it's much less of a finger pointing between the agency, the law enforcement agency and the social service and mental health agency. And they're actually sometimes at the microphone speaking together about what happened, how it happened, why it happened. And the agency doesn't look, the law enforcement agency no longer appears to be, the enemy. They are shown as a, working positively to try to resolve these types of issues to reduce the times when things go sideways. So in practice, we see it to be a very, very positive thing. And almost what I really like about it, while the work the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office is doing is absolutely wonderful, they're putting a lot of resources towards this issue. And unfortunately, not all agencies have the ability to put all those resources towards the issue. Something like this is, it's scalable. It can work in small agencies, it can work with large agencies, just depending on the resources you may have. And, because of that flexibility, that's where I see the advantage of something like this. It can work with agencies of 10 sworn personnel or agencies of 250 on up personnel. And if I can be of any assistance, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to help in any way possible.
Hello, everyone. Give me 1 second here to get loaded up. There we go. Whoop, there I go again. All right. Okay. All right, can you all see that?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're zooming in from. My name is Dr. Mike Pittaro. I'm Associate Professor of Criminal Justice with American Military University. And I wanted to take this presentation on somewhat of a unique turn, a little twist to it. We've obviously heard from Dr. Benton and Dr. Russo, Mr. Malone, about law enforcement's perspective. So I want to kind of twist this into corrections. And that's why I titled this particular slide, Correctional Officers Forgotten Behind the Walls. There's an abundance of literature on law enforcement and law enforcement working with, mentally ill subjects and so forth, but very little as far as what happens behind the walls within our nation's jails and corrections, or prisons rather. So I started this out by, I recently put this into a book, and I am putting a plug in here for my book, but I wanted to explain why. When I was an undergraduate student, they really focused on all the pros, I guess you could say, and the strengths of criminal justice and working in this profession, which I agree with, but not the disadvantages, the weakness, and the cons that are associated with it. So the book focuses on the things that pretty much anyone that works in criminal justice is going to experience working with this unique group of offenders that we're seeing in today's society, particularly with the mental illness that we're seeing. So just some statistics that I always throw out there I think are important. The US has 5% of the world's population, yet we have 25% of the world's incarcerated offenders. We are known, not necessarily in a positive way, as the incarceration nation. So we tend to, unfortunately, incarcerate more individuals than we do help them in the community. Although that is changing, we are making great progress in that respect. We have more than 400,000 correctional officers employed in the US. Now, this doesn't include clerical staff, it doesn't include administrators, contractors, volunteers, and so forth, but I want to hone in just on the correctional officer side of it. Because as the police are arresting these individuals and those that end up incarcerated, they end up in prisons and jails that are, for the most part, ill-equipped to deal with this particular offender. Training is inadequate. When I was still working in corrections, it was more of a warehousing type of approach. You simply incarcerate them, you medicate them. They may see a psychologist or a psychiatrist once a week just to check in on the medication. But we are making progress in that sense that we're starting to delve into it a little bit more and provide services for both men and women who are incarcerated. So the research has predominantly focused on stress, PTSD, and suicide of law enforcement officers, but largely ignored the same plight of correctional officers. So I'm kind of moving this conversation away from prisoners and inmates and switching it over to the officers, because I figure this is the great platform to do this, because this is not just something that is prevalent in the United States, but also abroad. So I wrote a paper years ago about suicide among correctional officers, and the amount of attention that it brought, not just within the US, which I kind of expected, but also abroad, was interesting. So this has kind of become my area that I've been passionate about, and an area that I want to continue to advocate for. So the studies that have been done, and once again, they're limited studies on correctional officers focusing on the stress from working in a correctional environment. 60%, and this is not just Mike Pittaro, this is others that have found this percentage, that it kind of hovers around 60% of the stress stems from policies, procedures, and the administrators themselves, which I'll get into in a little while, focusing on the administrative aspect of it and why that's a potential cause of stress. Other stressors, obviously the dangerousness of the job. In some facilities, you're looking at 60 prisoners to 1 officer. We now use a lot of direct supervision pod facilities. So that could jump up to 75 or even 90 prisoners to 1 officer. So the dangerousness of the job, for obvious reasons, is a concern. But then also the spike in mentally ill offenders, and this is due mostly to the deinstitutionalization movement that started in the 1960s and then kind of gained speed and momentum into the 70s and 80s, led to these offenders being essentially going from psychiatric facilities into our nation's prison systems. There's also other stressors of inadequate equipment, resources, mandatory overtime is huge, overcrowded facilities, and of course, staff shortages, to name a few. Now, this is an interesting statistic. The percentage of mentally ill offenders has increased 500% since the 1960s. That's astronomical. And these individuals, for the most part, many of them end up in the criminal justice system. And for most of them, it's for petty offenses. But the prisons are ill-equipped to still deal with this particular population, particularly those that are severely ill. I'll give you an example. When I still worked in corrections, we had an individual who continually tried to commit suicide. So he would jump off of, I don't know if he could really jump, but kind of dive off of his top bunk and dive into the floor, into the wall. He would ram his head into the wall. So we don't have padded rooms or anything of that nature. So what you end up doing is using some sort of restraint system, like a passive restraint system, to essentially tie this individual to their bed so they can't harm themselves. But that's a temporary, kind of like a Band-Aid approach that's ineffective in working with this particular offender. So if you keep them on a 24-hour type of supervision, that becomes very costly as well. Now, for this individual in particular, the crimes that he engaged in were fairly misdemeanor crimes, really nothing of significant risk to the community whatsoever. But when we sent him to a psychiatric facility for evaluation due to the suicide attempt, he was sent back within 24 hours saying that he was fine. So that just gives you one idea, like one glimpse into the system, that what do you do with an individual like this? We simply don't have the facilities nor the education or training to deal with this particular type of offender. So here's where I kind of want to switch it up a little bit, because we are dedicating a lot of time, effort, resources, and money, okay, into working with prisoners with mental illness, okay? We are providing services. We've developed new programs. We've introduced cognitive behavioral therapy into prisons. We've hired correctional psychologists. So we are making headway in that respect. However, we aren't giving enough attention to the actual correctional officers that work with these individuals and what they're encountering, their stress. And this is something that I really want to hone in on, because This is an area that a lot of people don't know the statistics on this and how prevalent this is. But if we compare correctional officers to the general public, you're going to see significantly higher rates of depression, anxiety, PTSD, and of course, suicide. Now, this is a concern. We have 20% higher divorce rates than the general public, which is significant since, you know, in the United States, we already have a high divorce rate. This just compounds matters even further. Higher rates of alcohol abuse. I say abuse in the sense that some of it may be problematic drinking. In other words, you may be drinking prior to coming on your shift or directly afterwards. But also something that we don't necessarily discuss is the misuse of prescription and over-the-counter medication. So you take sleeping pills to help you sleep because you can't sleep. You take something to keep you awake in the morning because you're so sleepy. So it becomes this very negative cycle of despair. And higher rates of cardiovascular disease. Hypertension, obesity are problematic. There's high rates of strokes, heart attacks, anything associated with heart disease is elevated in correctional officers in comparison to the general public. Now, this one is one that is shocking to most people. The correctional officer's life expectancy is between age 59 and 62. So this is 14 to 21 years shorter than the general public. If that's not concerning, I don't know what is. So these are individuals that are not dying by suicide, but it's just the stress of the job and how it's impacting them, not just physically, but also mentally, and how this impacts them even into retirement years. So the damage is essentially done by that point. Some say you can attribute it to the fight or flight response. It could be attributed to poor diet, poor nutrition, lack of exercise, particularly as some officers become very complacent, okay, over the years. That is a huge concern. And COs, okay, correctional officers are more likely to die by suicide than all other law enforcement professionals. That is something that we rarely hear about because, again, the focus is on law enforcement because they're more visible in the community. They're easier to research, they're easier to gather information, but within the prison walls, it's very difficult to do any type of qualitative studies, for instance, to get into the prisons to actually study them. And it's a lot of turf issues, a lot of privacy issues. A lot of administrators feel that this could present the prison and their employees in a negative light. So our studies are extremely limited, but we do know suicide rates are nearly twice that of law enforcement in general. So like law enforcement officers, COs, correctional officers, are more likely to die by their own hands than in the line of duty. Again, things that aren't necessarily publicized. We do hear about, you know, police shootings, correctional officers who are killed while on duty, but we really don't delve into the suicide aspect of it, showing that this number is significantly higher than we should be seeing. And then there's the stigma. The stigma is still there. You know, we like to say that the stigma is going away, but it's still prevalent. There's a lot of fear from a lot of officers that if they do try to seek help, that this is going to be held against them for any type of future promotions, lateral transfers. So they're very, very distrustful of the administration. And therefore, they try to bottle this information up, all these pent up stressors. And unfortunately, it comes out in negative coping strategies, namely drinking. So some plausible solutions, what I think is we need to strengthen awareness and advocacy efforts on behalf of the correctional officers. I, along with myself and some others around the country, we've been working together, which has been great. We have a great collaboration of trying to bring more attention to this particular vulnerable group. We need to change the culture of corrections since most of the stress is stemming from leadership, whether it's poor leadership or whether it's just simply leadership that's not respected, through transformational leadership. This is an area that I'm really passionate about as well. Transformational leaders, in a nutshell, are essentially coaches, mentors. They're kind of looking at learning moments, like what could you have done better, more so than being very punitive, very authoritative, and kind of that bullying aspect of it. So we need to get into a different mindset there with administrators if they want to keep individuals employed. And as many of you know, corrections has an extremely high turnover rate. And for many individuals, especially those straight out of college, it's often used as a stepping stone into other careers. So I'm trying to change that and make that actually a profession that individuals would want to actually pursue as a career path. We need more studies, simple, okay? The social scientist in me says we need more qualitative and quantitative research studies. It's limited. If you put up stress in law enforcement on Google, you're gonna get pages and pages. If you do the same with correctional officers, you're only gonna get a limited number of pages. So that has to change. We need to do more research and include females. This is another one. We're seeing an increase in the number of women entering this profession, but yet we don't know anything about them as far as any of the studies focusing on stress, burnout, morale. It focuses mostly on male correctional officers, more so than female correctional officers. Introduce emotional intelligence into on-the-job training, and I would start that in the academy. I'm passionate about that as well. Emotional intelligence essentially is how you react and respond to situations. It's been shown to be incredibly effective in the business world, and now we're starting to adopt it into the criminal justice world, so we can learn from that. And to me, would avoid a lot of these excessive force type of complaints that we hear about where the officer has lost control of his or her emotions. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for those of you who know this, this is a very effective evidence-based type of therapeutic approach that has been shown to be very effective in working with individuals that are a little bit difficult to get through to. So, and then what I put in here is therapists with corrections experience. Because there is a large distrust of outsiders, having somebody who has essentially been there, done that with some type of corrections experience is going to be more respected and more trusted among correctional officers than an outsider who has just the experience in cognitive behavioral therapy. And then obviously, individual group therapy, medication, anything to kind of help this. We need to start though by erasing that stigma, you know, minimizing the effects of this, that they actually can go forward to save lives. And that, my friends, is me in a nutshell.
Thank you, everyone, for these presentations. We have a few minutes left for questions, and we have a few. A question by Karen Lancaster Ellis. When a participant, while involved in the behavioral intervention, commits a violent, serious crime, how does the Behavioral Resources Unit respond to such an occurrence?
Thank you for the question, Karen. And it's just like any other law enforcement call. I will say this quick example. We had a gentleman, Richard Lardizabal, and he's a former Marine. He was dishonorably discharged for attacking a staff officer many years ago, not on our radar. He had an argument with his neighbor, and his solution to the argument over a noise complaint was to take an AR-15 out of his garage and point it at the neighbor. He thought that might not be a fair fight, goes back inside and rearms himself, this time with a samurai sword. So obviously there's some issues going on with Richard. He went back inside the house and barricaded. So it didn't end up being a SWAT call out or anything like that, because we really don't do that anymore in law enforcement for a single barricaded subject that's not an imminent threat to the community. So what did we do? With the Behavioral Resources Unit, we established phone contact with Richard. It took some time negotiating with him and his family. we were able to negotiate a peaceful resolve. He actually also lives with his elderly mother, so there was a lot of contingencies involved with that. But to get to the point of your question, we got him to give up, but we charged him with the aggravated assault, which is a felony. But we also did a Baker Act, which, like the Marchman Act I described, the Baker Act is where we take someone into involuntary custody for up to 72 hours or more based upon a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist post-diagnosis, and we can stabilize them under Florida law or get them to stabilization. So we did the felony charge, we charge them with that, and we do the Baker Act. It doesn't negate the criminal charge, because the definition of insanity in the legal sense with the Monotone rule is a whole other technical thing. It's not going to undermine the criminal charge. And in fact, part of what's going on in Hillsborough County is you have a very progressive judicial system. We have problem-solving court, and we have a veterans court that's specifically for veterans, that they can get into the court with a felony charge, and they specifically address issues that may be going on with that veteran, PTSD, life issues, other traumatic brain injury. There's a whole host of things. So our push was to get Richard into a problem-solving court, and that's where we have him, and we've positioned him. So the felony actually gives us a vehicle to do that. And he will have a mentorship with other veterans and veteran leaders that work with that court, and we can have more of a successful outcome. So in a way, our role is to help play negotiator to kind of fill that intermediary gap there with patrol, but we're looking at it from a behavioral health angle. Now, we came into this after patrol had already had a response. If we're there and something violent happens, the officer does what they would normally do based on their training and their protocol and call for backup or handle the situation. That's why we believe in the co-responder model, because it's just a safer way to practice. But nothing changes the practice of law enforcement in the application of law, other than we're looking at it through this mental health prism when that's part of a driver, if you will, for some of the criminal behavior. And I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you. There are a couple of related questions from Jacob Smith. First question is, what are some of the biggest challenges in having police departments around the country working alongside social workers to engage with mentally ill people? And how widespread do you think is this practice? In the same way, question for Charles Malone, what are some of the biggest challenges that behavioral health practitioners find in working alongside police departments?
I'll take the first question, and then I'll let Corporal Malone answer for his part of it. The biggest thing is going back to what I was talking about, how to change an organization. You're bringing in people, you're mixing two different cultures. You're mixing people from a clinical background that have had no real training other than what they've probably seen on TV, if you will, whether it's reality or just their favorite criminal justice show, to try and figure out what a law enforcement culture is actually like. And as anyone can tell you, whether it's corrections or law enforcement, my colleagues will share with you, cop culture is a different culture internally within an organization. It has its own stresses, its own nuances. And I think the marrying of those two cultures, people from a therapeutic background, and from the law enforcement background where there's a lot of de-escalation, a lot of mitigation, bringing those two worlds together and making the organizations fit. What I emphasize with the team that I'm consulting with and working with and supervising is I say, focus on the population. When all of it kind of starts getting confusing, look at the at-risk population, look at the homeless, look at the behavioral health, the mental health needs. If you focus on who you're trying to help, it seems like that common bond, you just come together, and it's almost like a football team. You're playing your position, I'm playing my position. Not everybody can be a quarterback. Somebody has to catch the football. Somebody has to run the football. Somebody has to block. If we all work together and focus on that goal, then I think it overcomes a lot of the change issues within the organization. But it's a learning process. I learn every day from our clinicians, and they learn something in turn from our law enforcement deputies. Corporal Malone.
So from my standpoint, it's just a caveat what Sergeant Benton was saying. The biggest thing is you have a lot of deputies who want to do the mental health side of things, want to do the behavioral health side of things, but we get so limited training in the academy on how to do it. Then you have the clinicians who are getting all of the training from an academic standpoint, and they may have practiced out in the field, but they have usually done it in a clinical and controlled environment, whereas it's an asymmetrical kinetic environment with law enforcement. So trying to figure out how to tactically deploy a clinician while at the same time showing the people that we're dealing with that we're not the police, because that's usually the thing that turns them off. That's kind of been the biggest challenge. And then just also for me, I'm a big team guy. You know, I'm a sports fan. So I kind of use the same analogy that Sergeant Benton is. So what I try to do is just try to always relate to sports and trying to get everybody to work together. You know, the clinicians have a specialty in a way where they can see things from a clinical perspective, but they don't always understand the law enforcement piece. So that's where I kind of say, hey, you know, we have our deputies. Let's look at it from a law enforcement standpoint. You teach the clinician the law enforcement implications. The clinician, you teach the deputy the psychology part. And that seems to work. You know, I see a lot of it working, and we come up with little things, you know, here and there. We like to put them in the cars together. We like to do, you know, they hang out together. We got one team that's attached like an umbilical cord. So we do things to kind of make them work together. And once they realize that they have some commonality of really wanting to help, which is what Sergeant Bent was getting at, focusing on a population, because most cops want to help, but they just have been trained to do it in a different way. Whereas the clinicians, they also want to help, but they think in a different way. So to put them together and focus on helping the person, it works. But that has been a challenge.
Thank you, everyone. I don't see any more questions, and we're running out of time. So thank you, Michael, Chuck, Charles, and Duane for being here today. I want to remind everybody that the sessions are being recorded, and next week the videos will be posted in the agenda. Right now, where you are seeing the live streaming links, those links will be replaced with new links to the video recordings. We have videos of all our conferences. They're all open access, and we encourage people use them for classroom use and teaching. So thank you again, and we hope to see our attendees in the next panels. Thank you. Have a good day.